At the height of American ambition, one man decided that money alone was not enough. He wanted proof built in stone, steel, and silence. What rose from the ground was not just a home, but the most expensive private residence ever constructed in the United States. Hundreds of rooms. Endless corridors. Technology decades ahead of its time. A palace meant to last forever. But history has a cruel pattern. What is built too large for its moment often becomes too heavy for its future. As fortunes shifted and the world changed, this house did not adapt. It waited. And slowly, the dream that created it began to collapse under its own weight. This is not a story about architecture. It is a story about ambition, and the price of believing it has no limits. At the dawn of the 20th century, the United States stood in the midst of a transformation so rapid that even those who benefited most from it struggled to fully comprehend its scale. Railroads stitched the continent together with iron veins. Factories thundered day and night, and vast fortunes appeared almost overnight. Wealth, once accumulated slowly over generations, now materialized within a single lifetime. In this new America, money was no longer merely a measure of comfort or security. It had become a force capable of reshaping cities, rewriting social hierarchies, and redefining what it meant to leave a legacy. For a small and powerful class of industrial titans, wealth demanded physical expression. Bank accounts and stock certificates were invisible. Power, to feel real, had to be seen. It had to occupy space. It had to dominate landscapes. Architecture became the chosen language through which this new American aristocracy spoke to history. Across New York, Newport, and the rolling estates of the Northeast, mansions rose that deliberately echoed European palaces. Marble columns, imported tapestries, grand staircases, and formal gardens all served a single purpose: to prove that American wealth was no longer inferior to old-world nobility. Yet for one man, even these symbols were insufficient. He was not content with building a grand house. He envisioned something far more radical, a private residence so vast, so technologically advanced, and so extravagantly expensive that it would eclipse every domestic structure that had come before it. This was not merely an architectural ambition. It was a philosophical one. The idea of the most expensive private home ever built in America was born from a mindset shaped by absolute confidence in industry, in progress, and in the belief that economic growth had no natural ceiling. The man behind the project had made his fortune in an era that rewarded scale above all else. Bigger factories outperformed smaller ones. Larger networks crushed regional competitors. Success came not from restraint, but from expansion without hesitation. Naturally, his home would follow the same logic. From the outset, the project was conceived not as a residence, but as a self-contained world. It would contain hundreds of rooms, each with a specific function. Public spaces would rival those of luxury hotels. Private quarters would offer unprecedented levels of comfort. Service areas would operate with near-industrial efficiency, employing a small army of staff whose presence was meant to remain invisible, yet indispensable. The location was chosen with surgical precision, close enough to the centers of financial and political influence to remain relevant, yet distant enough to ensure complete privacy. The land itself was expansive, allowing not only for the structure, but for gardens, terraces, service roads, and auxiliary buildings. Nature, in this vision, was not something to be admired from afar. It was something to be organized, disciplined, and framed to enhance the authority of the architecture it surrounded. Planning stretched on for years. Blueprints were drawn, revised, and discarded. No single architectural style was considered sufficient. Instead, the design absorbed influences from European palaces, American Beaux Arts traditions, and modern engineering principles. The goal was not harmony, but supremacy. The house needed to overwhelm to communicate, without a single spoken word, that it belonged to someone operating on a level unreachable by ordinary standards. Cost estimates, when they were discussed at all, were treated as flexible suggestions rather than limits. Materials were sourced globally. Stone was selected not only for durability, but for symbolic permanence. Steel frameworks were engineered to support vast open spaces, while the latest innovations in electrical systems, plumbing, heating, and ventilation were incorporated to ensure that the house represented the cutting edge of modern living. What made this project truly unprecedented, however, was not its scale alone, but the era in which it was undertaken. America was still defining itself. Public discourse celebrated democracy, opportunity, and the idea that anyone could rise through merit and effort. Yet here stood a private home whose cost alone exceeded what entire towns would see in decades. Its existence posed an uncomfortable question: if no kings ruled America, why were palaces being built? As construction progressed, the house began to attract attention. Newspapers reported on its dimensions, with a mix of awe and disbelief. Rumors circulated about the number of rooms, the height of its ceilings, and the staggering sums being spent. To some, it represented the pinnacle of American success, a monument to what ambition could achieve. To others, it felt like a warning sign, a visible crack in the promise that prosperity would benefit all. Inside the project, pressures mounted quietly. Complexity bred delay. Every design enhancement required further engineering. Every imported material introduced logistical challenges. The workforce expanded, schedules slipped, and costs climbed ever higher. Yet momentum carried the project forward. To stop would have been to admit limits, and limits were something this generation of magnates refused to acknowledge. Beyond the estate walls, the world was beginning to shift. Economic inequalities deepened. Labor unrest spread across industrial centers. Financial systems grew increasingly interconnected, and therefore increasingly fragile. These changes were subtle, easy to ignore from the vantage point of extraordinary wealth. But history was already gathering the forces that would soon test even the most fortified symbols of power. At this stage of the story, the house still stood as a promise rather than a burden. It embodied confidence, control, and belief in an endlessly ascending future. Yet embedded within its foundations was a contradiction that would later prove impossible to escape. A structure built to demonstrate permanence, rising in a society defined by volatility. The most expensive private home ever built in America was ascending physically, financially, and symbolically. But its rise was occurring at the precise moment when the age that made it possible was approaching its breaking point. By the time construction moved beyond foundations and steel skeletons, the project had already crossed an invisible threshold. What began as an ambitious residence was now something far more complex. A private empire under construction, governed by its own rules, rhythms, and scale of operation. The site functioned less like a household and more like a major industrial undertaking, where architecture, logistics, and labor converged into a continuous, grinding process that consumed time and capital with astonishing speed. Hundreds of workers arrived each day before dawn. Stonecutters shaped massive blocks to exact specifications. Ironworkers assembled structural frameworks designed to support rooms larger than most public buildings of the era. Carpenters, electricians, plumbers, and decorative artisans worked simultaneously, often in different wings of the same structure, rarely seeing the project as a whole. No single person, aside from the owner and a small circle of architects and engineers, fully grasped the totality of what was being built. The scale of the interior spaces defied conventional domestic logic. Ballrooms were designed to host hundreds, not for daily living but for moments of spectacle. Dining halls stretched so wide that voices would echo across them. demanding careful acoustic engineering. Libraries rose vertically as much as they spread horizontally. Their walls planned to carry thousands of volumes, many purchased not to be read, but to signal erudition, permanence, and cultural authority. Behind these public-facing rooms existed a hidden world. Service corridors ran parallel to grand hallways, allowing staff to move unseen. Kitchens were organized like factories, capable of preparing meals for banquets on a scale rivaling luxury hotels. Laundry facilities, storage rooms, and mechanical spaces filled entire floors, reminding anyone who studied the plans closely that luxury at this level depended on relentless invisible labor. Technological modernity was one of the project's quiet obsessions. Electricity was integrated not merely for illumination, but for atmosphere, control, and reliability. Heating systems were engineered to maintain comfort across vast interior volumes during harsh winters. Elevators connected floors that, in a normal house, would never have existed. The goal was to ensure that no inconvenience, however small, could intrude upon the experience of command and ease the owner expected. With each innovation came added cost, not incremental increases, but exponential ones. Systems interacted, requiring redesigns. Structural reinforcements multiplied as rooms grew larger and ceilings higher. Imported materials were delayed by strikes, shipping bottlenecks, and international tensions. Each problem was solved with money, but money alone could not compress time. As years passed, the house became known less for its intended function and more for its appetite. Newspapers reported figures that escalated with each retelling. What had once sounded implausible now seemed almost mythical. Estimates of total cost rose into territories previously associated only with public infrastructure or national institutions. The very idea that such resources were being devoted to a single private residence unsettled many observers, even as it fascinated them. Inside the owner's world, however, this escalation felt natural. He had built his fortune by expanding when others hesitated. Risk, to him, was not something to be minimized, but something to be mastered through scale. The house reflected the same philosophy. To reduce it, to simplify it, would be to betray the logic that had brought him success in the first place. Yet subtle shifts were taking place. Maintaining oversight grew more difficult as complexity increased. Decisions once made quickly now required layers of consultation. The house, in a sense, was beginning to govern its creator. Construction schedules dictated social calendars. Financial planning increasingly revolved around sustaining progress rather than envisioning completion. Beyond the estate, the broader American economy was entering a period of tension. Industrial growth continued, but warning signs appeared beneath the surface. Markets showed volatility. Credit systems grew strained. Public attitudes toward extreme wealth began to harden, shaped by labor conflicts, political reform movements, and a growing awareness of inequality. These developments did not immediately threaten the project, but they altered the environment in which it existed. The house stood at a crossroads between eras. It embodied the optimism of unlimited expansion, yet it was being completed in a world becoming less tolerant of unchecked excess. Its sheer presence, vast, unapologetic, and private, made it increasingly symbolic, whether its owner intended that or not. By the time the final wings approached completion, the project had achieved something paradoxical. It succeeded beyond measure in redefining what a private home could be, while simultaneously exposing the fragility of the assumptions that made such ambition possible. The building now loomed not only over its grounds, but over the reputation and future of the man who commissioned it. What remained uncertain was whether this architectural triumph would become a sanctuary of lasting power or a monument to a moment that history was already beginning to leave behind. By the time the residence neared completion, It had ceased to be merely a project and had become a condition of life. Its presence reshaped daily routines, financial priorities, and even personal identity. What was once imagined as a retreat from the pressures of public success had instead evolved into a structure that demanded constant attention, relentless resources, and unwavering commitment. The house no longer waited patiently to be inhabited. It asserted itself, insisting on completion, perfection, and preservation at any cost. The final stages of construction were the most delicate and the most revealing. Decorative finishes, unlike structural elements, offered no forgiveness. Marble floors had to align flawlessly across enormous distances. Hand-carved woodwork required months of labor for spaces that might only be used a handful of times each year. Murals, ceilings, and ornamental details were designed to be admired from specific angles, under specific lighting conditions, at specific moments of the day. Every choice assumed that the future would provide unlimited time and money to sustain such precision. But time, unlike wealth, was already beginning to slip out of control. As the house transitioned from construction site to functioning residence, a new reality emerged. Operating the building required an infrastructure as complex as its creation. Heating vast interior volumes consumed extraordinary amounts of fuel. Electrical systems demanded constant monitoring. Roofs, terraces, and facades magnificent in appearance were exposed to weather across immense surfaces, each section vulnerable to deterioration. What had once been a one-time investment now revealed itself as a permanent obligation. Staffing alone presented challenges that few private individuals had ever faced. The house required dozens of full-time employees, each with specialized roles. Turnover was inevitable. Training was continuous. Payrolls rivaled those of mid-sized companies. Even brief interruptions in illness, a labor dispute, a supply shortage could ripple through the household, disrupting the illusion of effortless grandeur. Public fascination intensified as the doors finally opened. Guests marveled at the scale, the comfort, and the spectacle. Social gatherings held within the house became events unto themselves, discussed far beyond those who attended. For a moment, the residence achieved exactly what it had been designed to do. It established its owner as a figure, operating beyond conventional measures of success. Yet admiration carried an undercurrent of unease. In a nation increasingly attentive to reform, labor rights, and economic fairness, the house began to feel out of step with the mood of the country. Journalists framed it not only as a marvel, but as an extreme example of excess. Political commentators cited it when discussing the concentration of wealth. The building, silent and immovable, became part of debates it had never intended to enter. Meanwhile, the owner himself confronted a quieter, more personal shift. The satisfaction anticipated at completion proved elusive. Instead of relief, there was maintenance. Instead of finality, there were ongoing decisions. The house demanded as much energy to preserve as it had to create. What had once symbolized mastery now introduced a new form of vulnerability, dependence on constant economic stability. That stability was no longer guaranteed. Financial systems, stretched by speculation and uneven growth, showed increasing signs of strain. Markets fluctuated unpredictably. Confidence so essential to the era's sense of progress began to erode. For those whose fortunes were deeply intertwined with industrial cycles, wealth could still appear vast on paper while becoming fragile in practice. The house, with its fixed costs and immovable presence, offered no flexibility. It could not scale down. It could not adapt quickly. Every downturn amplified its weight. The very characteristics that made it extraordinary also made it unforgiving. What emerged during this period was a profound irony. The residence had been built to secure a legacy, to project permanence in a world defined by change. Yet it now stood as a constant reminder that permanence was an illusion, especially when tied to economic systems beyond any single individual's control. As the broader historical currents gathered strength, the house waited. Its walls remained solid, its rooms immaculate, its grounds carefully maintained. But beneath the surface, the balance that sustained it was growing increasingly precarious. The question was no longer whether the most expensive private home ever built in America could endure physically. Stone and steel would likely survive. The true uncertainty lay elsewhere. Whether the world that had made such a house possible still existed, and if not, what fate awaited a monument built for an era that was already fading. The shift, when it came, did not announce itself with a single catastrophic moment. There was no clear dividing line between security and crisis. No instant when the owner of the great house could point to the calendar and say that everything had changed. Instead, the transformation unfolded gradually through accumulating pressures that altered the meaning of wealth itself. Confidence weakened. Margins tightened. What once felt like excess capital began to feel like exposed vulnerability. The house stood unchanged, immovable and serene, even as the financial world around it grew increasingly unstable. Its walls did not register stock market fluctuations. Its ceilings did not lower in response to tightening credit. Yet every economic tremor outside the estate reverberated within it. The cost of maintaining such a structure was fixed, relentless, and immune to optimism. Heat had to be paid for. Staff had to be compensated. Repairs could not be postponed indefinitely without inviting visible decay. In earlier years, these expenses had seemed insignificant compared to the owner's overall fortune. Now they required attention. Liquidity mattered more than valuation. Assets that had once been sources of pride, expansive holdings, long-term investments, complex enterprises became liabilities when they could not be converted quickly enough into cash. The house, magnificent and indivisible, was the most conspicuous of these liabilities. Public sentiment hardened further as economic uncertainty spread. The cultural climate that had celebrated boldness and scale began to favor restraint and accountability. Reform movements gained momentum. Journalists and politicians increasingly framed extreme wealth, not as evidence of genius, but as a structural imbalance that demanded correction. In this changing atmosphere, the house no longer read as an achievement. It read as provocation. The owner felt this shift acutely, even if he rarely acknowledged it aloud. Invitations grew fewer. Admiration gave way to scrutiny. Where guests once marveled at the grandeur, they now whispered about its cost. The residence had become too large to be neutral. It demanded interpretation, and that interpretation was no longer entirely flattering. Operational realities grew harsher. Staffing levels were quietly reduced, then adjusted again when reductions proved impractical. Certain wings of the house were closed off to conserve resources, their rooms darkened, their silence a stark contrast to the liveliness once envisioned. Maintenance schedules were stretched. Decisions that once prioritized perfection now weighed compromise against expense. Psychologically, this marked a turning point. The house had been conceived as a sanctuary, a space of control and certainty. Now it functioned as a constant reminder of exposure. Each bill, each repair, each logistical complication underscored the same truth: size had eliminated flexibility. There was no modest version of this house, no scaled-down existence to retreat into without fundamentally abandoning the vision that had defined it. Beyond the estate, broader forces accelerated. Financial systems convulsed. Confidence collapsed. Institutions that had seemed permanent proved fragile. For individuals whose fortunes were intertwined with these systems, losses cascaded rapidly. The distance between immense wealth and financial distress shrank with startling speed. The house, built to symbolize permanence, now stood as a silent witness to impermanence. Its stone facade absorbed no shock. Its gardens bloomed and faded with the seasons. Yet the economic logic that sustained it was unraveling. The contradiction was unavoidable. A structure designed to last centuries depended on a financial reality that could shift in months. Attempts to adapt followed. Portions of the estate were reconsidered. Ideas that would once have seemed unthinkable, leasing, partial closure, eventual sale, entered discussions. Each represented a psychological concession as much as a practical one. To alter the house's purpose was to admit that the era of unlimited expansion had ended. What made this moment especially profound was its inevitability in retrospect. The house had been conceived during a peak, when upward momentum felt natural and self-sustaining. It reached completion just as the foundations of that momentum weakened. Timing more than miscalculation had turned ambition into burden. By now, the residence no longer defined the future. It embodied the past, a past of confidence, excess, and faith in boundless growth. Its fate was no longer entirely in the hands of its creator. It would be shaped by forces larger than any individual: economic cycles, public opinion, and historical judgment. As the world moved decisively into a harsher chapter, the most expensive private home ever built in America stood poised between endurance and decline. Its walls remained intact. Its vision remained visible. But its meaning had changed irrevocably, transforming from a monument of ascent into a question history was preparing to answer. There comes a point in every long historical arc when pressure stops accumulating and finally releases. For the great house, that moment did not arrive with the collapse of a single institution or the failure of a single investment. It arrived when the owner, forced to confront realities he had long postponed, realized that the logic which had built the house could no longer sustain it. What had once been an extension of his power now exposed its limits with unforgiving clarity. The first signs were subtle but decisive. Financial advisors spoke in more cautious tones. Liquidity, once abundant, became a recurring concern. Revenues fluctuated while fixed costs remained immovable. The house, which had never been designed to respond to contraction, offered no relief. It demanded the same level of care, regardless of circumstance. Every month became an exercise in prioritization, every decision a negotiation between pride and necessity. Public perception sharpened the strain. In an era marked by hardship and uncertainty, extravagance ceased to be admired. It became suspect. The house, previously shielded by fascination, was now framed as a symbol of imbalance, an artifact of an age that many believed had failed them. Its grandeur no longer insulated its owner, it isolated him. Social life within the estate diminished. Rooms once filled with voices and music stood silent. Entire sections were shut down, their furnishings preserved but unused, like museum exhibits awaiting visitors who would never come. The reduction was practical, but its psychological impact was profound. The house had been built for abundance, for movement, for presence. In stillness it felt exposed, almost hollow. Maintenance began to lag. Not dramatically at first, just enough to be noticeable to those who knew where to look. Paint weathered. Gardens lost their meticulous precision. Minor repairs were delayed, then reconsidered, then postponed again. Each compromise chipped away at the illusion of permanence that had defined the project from its inception. Behind closed doors, conversations turned toward outcomes once considered unthinkable. Could the house be transferred? Repurposed? Sold? The market, however, offered little encouragement. Structures of such scale and specificity had almost no natural buyers. What had made the residence unique also made it nearly impossible to absorb into a new context. Its value, immense on paper, became abstract in practice. This was the final contradiction of the dream. The house had been built as a singular expression of success, yet its singularity now trapped it. It could not easily change hands. It could not easily change function. It existed on terms defined by a world that no longer existed. For the owner, the reckoning was deeply personal. The house had been more than shelter. It had been a reflection of self, a physical narrative of ascent. To watch it slip beyond control was to confront the fragility not only of wealth, but of identity. The qualities that had once driven triumph, confidence, expansion, refusal to retreat, now offered no solution. History, indifferent to intention, continued forward. Economic realities hardened. Institutions restructured. Social values recalibrated. The house remained where it was. Monumental and silent, increasingly out of step with the society around it. What followed was not a dramatic collapse, but a slow unraveling. Decisions were made incrementally, each one slightly narrowing the future. Options disappeared not through catastrophe, but through erosion. The dream did not shatter in a single moment. It cracked, quietly and repeatedly, until its original form could no longer be sustained. By the end of this phase, the fate of the most expensive private home ever built in America was no longer a question of ambition or vision. It was a question of survival, of whether such a structure could continue to exist as what it was originally meant to be, or whether it would be forced to transform into something history had not intended. The answer was approaching. When the house finally slipped beyond its owner's ability to sustain it, the transition was neither ceremonial nor clean. There was no closing night, no formal farewell. Instead, abandonment arrived gradually, disguised as practicality. Staff numbers were reduced again. Operations were consolidated into fewer rooms. Lights went dark in wings that had once embodied the height of architectural ambition. What remained was not emptiness, but a lingering presence, a building too large to disappear and too costly to fully inhabit. In this phase, the house entered a peculiar state of suspension. It was no longer truly alive as a home, yet it had not fully crossed into ruin. Furniture remained in place. Decorative details survived intact. The infrastructure continued to function in fragments, maintained just enough to prevent collapse. The building existed in a condition that preservationists would later recognize well. Neither occupied nor abandoned, but waiting. The owner's relationship to the house changed fundamentally. It ceased to represent achievement and became instead a reminder of misjudged permanence, of confidence outrunning circumstance. Visits, once frequent and celebratory, became rare and brief. Each return underscored the same truth. The house could not be reduced to memory. Its physical reality demanded acknowledgement. Outside forces now shaped its fate more than personal will. Financial obligations tightened. Legal considerations multiplied. The property attracted attention not for what it promised, but for what it symbolized. Journalists described it in tones that bordered on moral judgment. What had once been framed as visionary excess was now interpreted as cautionary evidence of imbalance and overreach. Time proved relentless. Even without human presence, large structures age aggressively. Moisture found seams. Mechanical systems deteriorated without constant use. Landscaped grounds, once carefully controlled, began to soften, their geometry eroded by seasons indifferent to design. The house resisted decay, but only at a price that no longer seemed justifiable. Yet complete abandonment remained elusive. To walk away entirely would have meant accepting failure in its most visible form. Instead, the house lingered in a state of partial care, enough to prevent catastrophe, not enough to restore vitality. This limbo would define the building for years, sometimes decades, depending on circumstance. Culturally, the narrative shifted again. The house began to attract a different kind of fascination. Not admiration, but curiosity. It became a subject of rumor, speculation, and retrospective analysis. People wondered what it had been like at its peak, what conversations its walls had once contained, and what lessons it now offered. The building's silence invited interpretation. The broader society, having passed through economic upheaval, looked back on the era that produced such a structure with a mix of disbelief and distance. Values had changed. The idea of pouring such resources into a single private residence felt increasingly alien. The house, immovable and unapologetic in scale, now belonged more to history than to contemporary life. What emerged during this period was a strange inversion. In losing its function, the house gained meaning. It was no longer an expression of one man's ambition, but a collective artifact, a physical document of a specific moment in American history, when confidence in progress overshadowed caution, and wealth sought permanence through stone and steel. Still, meaning alone could not guarantee survival. Without a clear purpose, the house remained vulnerable. Its future depended not on its original intent, but on whether a new narrative could be imposed upon it, one that justified its continued existence in a world that no longer built such things. The question facing the house now was stark and unavoidable. Would it be allowed to fade quietly, consumed by neglect and time? Or could it be reborn, transformed into something that spoke not of private dominance, but of shared memory? History, once again, was preparing to decide. The turning point did not come from the original owner, nor from the financial systems that had once sustained the house. It came from time itself, and from a gradual shift in how society understood the meaning of such a structure. What had once been dismissed as an impractical excess began to be reconsidered as something else entirely, a historical artifact too significant to ignore, too revealing to abandon. As years passed, the house settled into public consciousness as a relic of a vanished worldview. Its very improbability became its value. Preservationists, historians, and cultural institutions began to see in its walls a rare opportunity not to celebrate extravagance, but to study it. The building offered insight into an era when wealth sought architectural immortality, when private ambition rivaled public monuments, and when confidence in progress obscured the fragility beneath. Discussions about the house's future shifted in tone. Where earlier conversations revolved around cost and burden, new ones centered on responsibility. Could such a structure be allowed to disappear, taking with it the physical evidence of a formative chapter in American history? Or did its survival, however uncomfortable, serve a larger educational purpose? Any attempt at revival required confronting difficult realities. Restoring or maintaining a structure of this scale demanded resources approaching those that had originally built it. Modern safety codes, accessibility requirements, and infrastructure standards introduced new layers of complexity. Preservation was not an act of nostalgia, it was a negotiation between past and present. Slowly, carefully, a new identity began to take shape. The house was no longer framed as a failed home, but as a document written in stone. Its rooms became narratives. Its corridors mapped social hierarchies. Its mechanical systems testified to early modern engineering ambition. Every excess, once criticized, became a point of interpretation rather than embarrassment. Public access, when it came, altered the relationship between the house and the society that surrounded it. Visitors moved through spaces once reserved for an elite few, now recontextualized through explanation rather than privilege. What had been private dominance became shared inquiry. The house no longer asserted power, it invited reflection. Importantly, this transformation did not erase the original contradictions. The scale remained overwhelming. The imbalance between private wealth and public need remained visible. But rather than conceal these truths, the preserved house exposed them. It allowed history to be confronted rather than simplified. In this new role, the house achieved a form of permanence its creator could never have predicted. Not permanence as possession, but permanence as memory. It endured not because it continued to function as intended, but because it revealed something essential about the era that produced it. The irony was complete. A structure built to immortalize one individual ultimately outlived that purpose by surrendering it. Its survival depended on letting go of exclusivity, on accepting reinterpretation, and on existing not as a triumph, but as a lesson. As the house entered this final phase of its transformation, it stood no longer at the mercy of economic cycles or personal fortune. Its fate was now tied to collective choice, whether society valued the uncomfortable truths embedded in its walls enough to preserve them. The most expensive private home ever built in America had ceased to be private in meaning, even if its origins remained so. What it had become was something rarer, a mirror held up to history, reflecting ambition, excess, vulnerability, and the cost of believing that success alone could guarantee permanence. Only one question remained unanswered, not whether the house would survive, but how it would ultimately be remembered.